Berlin, November 1939. At night, the city disappeared. Curtains were pulled tight across every window. Streetlights were extinguished. Trams slowed, their interiors dimmed to a sickly yellow glow. From above, Berlin looked like a dead organism pretending not to breathe. The blackout was meant to protect the city from bombers, but it had another effect. It erased certainty. When light vanished, imagination filled the gaps. Inside government buildings, however, work did not stop. Maps lay spread across heavy oak tables. Red and blue pins marked divisions, supply routes, projected offensives. Reports arrived hourly. Fuel estimates, troop morale, rail capacity. The language was precise, bureaucratic, mechanical. War reduced to numbers. And yet, on some desks, beneath folders stamped Geheime Reichssache, state secret, there lay another kind of paper. Circular diagrams, lines dividing the sky into mathematical segments. Symbols copied from tables older than the Reich itself. Horoscopes, not the kind sold in newspapers or whispered about in cafes. These were calculated charts, drawn by hand, cross-referenced with ephemerides, dates, and exact times. They did not speak of love or fortune. They spoke of danger, convergence, collapse. No official document admitted they existed. No memo ordered their creation. But they were there. Because the Third Reich, for all its obsession with rational control, was terrified of the future. Nazism promised destiny. It spoke constantly of inevitability, of history bending toward German domination as if guided by natural law. But the closer war came, the more fragile that certainty became. Campaigns could fail. Leaders could die. Chance, an enemy the regime refused to acknowledge, hovered everywhere. Astrology offered something seductive, the illusion that chaos could be mapped. It was not magic that attracted the leadership. It was structure. Astrology used numbers, cycles, repetitions. It looked scientific enough to pass as analysis, ancient enough to feel profound. In a system that despised doubt, it offered reassurance disguised as calculation. And so, quietly, astrologers were consulted. Some were opportunists, some true believers, some simply desperate to survive in a system that consumed people whole. A few were arrested, even as others were questioned in secret. The regime publicly denounced superstition while privately fearing it. One name, however, rose above the rest. A man who did not dress like a mystic, who did not speak in riddles, who insisted that fate could be calculated with the same cold logic as ballistics. Karl Ernst Krafft was Swiss, born in Basel in 1900. Trained in mathematics and statistics, he approached astrology not as prophecy, but as probability. To him, the heavens were not divine. They were data. Patterns repeated, cycles returned. History, he believed, moved according to rhythms humanity had forgotten how to read. In the 1930s, Krafft lived on the margins. He wrote, calculated, published small works no one noticed. He was not a Nazi ideologue. He was not a dissident. He was something more dangerous to a totalitarian system, an independent mind convinced of his own method. By late 1939, war had already begun. Poland had fallen. Europe watched and waited. Inside Germany, the atmosphere was tense, almost brittle. Victory was expected, but fear seeped through the cracks. It was then that Krafft sent a letter, not to a newspaper, not to a publisher, to the authorities. The warning was specific, uncomfortably so. Krafft claimed that between November 7th and November 10th, 1939, Adolf Hitler faced mortal danger. The planetary alignments, he argued, indicated a violent disruption focused on the Führer himself. The letter did not demand attention. It did not beg for protection. It simply stated what Krafft believed the numbers showed. On the evening of November 8, 1939, Adolf Hitler spoke at the burgerbraukeller in Munich, commemorating the anniversary of the failed beer hall putsch. The speech ended earlier than planned. Hitler left the hall at 9:07 p.m. At 9:20 p.m., a bomb exploded. The blast tore through the hall, collapsing the ceiling. 8 people were killed. Dozens were wounded. The Führer was already on his train. Within hours, the Gestapo retrieved Krafft's letter. Suddenly, astrology was no longer a curiosity. Krafft was arrested, not as a suspect in the bombing, but as something more unsettling. A man who had predicted the attempt. A man who appeared to have read the future with disturbing accuracy. For a brief moment, it seemed the stars had proven themselves useful. But usefulness in the Third Reich was never safety. Krafft was questioned, his methods examined, his calculations copied. Officials wanted answers that astrology could not provide. How long will the war last? When will victory come? Who will betray us? Astrology could suggest tendencies, probabilities, moments of risk. It could not offer guarantees. And that was its fatal flaw. At the same time Krafft was being interrogated, the regime was moving to suppress astrology publicly. In 1941, following Rudolf Hess's unauthorized flight to Britain, an act linked by propaganda to mystical delusions, astrology, occult societies, and esoteric groups were banned. Practitioners were arrested. Books were confiscated. The message was clear. The Reich tolerated no rival explanations of destiny. And yet, behind closed doors, the charts did not disappear. This contradiction, denunciation paired with secret reliance, revealed something essential about power under the Third Reich. The leadership did not believe in astrology the way believers do. They feared it. Feared that it might be true. Feared that it might be false. Feared most of all that it might expose how little control they actually had. Krafft became trapped inside that fear. No longer free. No longer fully trusted. Too accurate to ignore. Too unpredictable to keep. He was forced to calculate for others, to reinterpret the skies in ways that reassured rather than warned. At the same time, he was stripped of protection, status, and autonomy. Astrology had elevated him and condemned him. As the war dragged on, the gap between promised destiny and lived reality widened. Stalingrad, Allied bombings, losses that could not be explained away by ideology. The future became darker, less legible. Astrology, once consulted in hope, became a liability. By 1943, Krafft was no longer an asset. He was a reminder of uncertainty. A man who had once spoken of danger and been proven right. A man who understood patterns well enough to recognize collapse when he saw it. In a regime built on the illusion of inevitability, that was unforgivable. Krafft was sent east in early 1945, deported under conditions that were barely documented. Somewhere along the way, likely in a camp, amid disease and exhaustion, he died. No official announcement, no acknowledgement of his service, no prophecy marking his end. The man who warned of death could not escape it. When the war ended, files were burned, charts destroyed. The Reich collapsed without ever admitting how deeply it had feared the future it claimed to command. What remains is not evidence of magic, but of desperation. A totalitarian system that trusted guns and gas chambers still glanced upward in the dark, searching for meaning in the stars. Not because it believed in fate, but because it could not bear the thought that fate did not exist. And that, perhaps, is the most horrifying truth of all. The Third Reich spoke the language of certainty. Its speeches promised inevitability. Its posters showed history marching in lockstep toward victory. Its leaders insisted that Germany was not merely choosing its path, but fulfilling one. Destiny was not a metaphor. It was a political tool. If the future was predetermined, then resistance was meaningless, doubt was treason, and crimes became necessities. But certainty, when enforced, creates its opposite: fear. By 1940, fear had settled deep inside the upper levels of the Nazi state. The early victories, Poland, Norway, France, had come quickly, almost too easily. The regime celebrated momentum, but privately, many sensed imbalance. Empires that rose too fast often fell the same way. History was filled with examples. The leadership knew this. They studied history obsessively. They feared repeating it. Astrology offered a strange comfort, not because it promised mercy, but because it promised order. In the worldview of the Reich, the universe itself was hierarchical. Strong forces dominated weak ones. Cycles repeated. Empires rose and fell according to laws that could be understood, if one was intelligent enough, disciplined enough, ruthless enough. Astrology fit neatly into this belief. It suggested that chaos was only apparent, that beneath randomness lay structure. The appeal was not mystical. It was bureaucratic. Astrological charts reduced the future to diagrams, lines, angles, tables. They looked like engineering schematics of fate. For men accustomed to planning invasions years in advance, this was irresistible. Among those most drawn to such thinking was Heinrich Himmler. Himmler viewed the SS not merely as a military or police organization, but as a spiritual elite. He spoke of blood, ancestry, and inherited destiny with near-religious intensity. Under his influence, symbolism flourished. Runes, rituals, ceremonies timed to solstices. None of this was officially labeled occult, but its function was unmistakable. It bound violence to myth. To Himmler and others like him, the future was something to be unlocked, not awaited. At the same time, Adolf Hitler himself was deeply superstitious, though inconsistent. He distrusted professional mystics, mocked spiritualists, and publicly dismissed astrology. Yet, he constantly spoke of fate sparing him, of providence guiding his survival through the First World War, of destiny choosing him above others. He rejected astrology in theory, while embracing it emotionally. This contradiction mattered, because it meant that astrology could never be openly endorsed, but it could be quietly used. The Reich maintained a double reality. In public, superstition was ridiculed, associated with weakness, degeneracy, or Jewish influence. In private, questions were asked that had no military answers. When is the most dangerous period? Who is at risk? When does the tide turn? These were not questions strategy could fully address. Astrology crept into the gaps left by uncertainty, not as guidance, but as reassurance. By late 1940, Germany faced new variables. Britain had not fallen. The air war intensified. The invasion of the Soviet Union was being planned under conditions of extraordinary risk. Barbarossa was not merely a military gamble. It was a bet on time itself. Victory depended on speed, weather, morale, logistics, factors that history showed could easily unravel. The leadership wanted confirmation that history was on their side. Astrological consultations did not occur in grand halls. They took place through intermediaries, informal channels, whispered requests. Charts were passed hand to hand, never filed officially. No signatures, no letterheads, only calculations. Those who produced results that aligned with optimism were remembered. Those who warned of danger were not rewarded, but they were listened to, and then watched. This was the trap into which Karl Ernst Krafft stepped. Kraft's approach differed from most practitioners. He rejected vague symbolism. He focused on precise dates, planetary transits, and statistical recurrence. He spoke not of destiny, but of probability spikes, periods where violence, disruption, or death were more likely. To military minds, this sounded almost scientific. Yet it carried an unbearable implication. If disaster could be predicted, then disaster could not be denied. That was dangerous. The Reich could tolerate mysticism only as long as it supported confidence. The moment it introduced doubt, it became subversive. Astrology, by its nature, was ambivalent. It did not promise victory, only risk. This tension intensified after November 1939. Krafft's correct warning about Hitler's danger did not elevate astrology into policy. Instead, it transformed astrologers into liabilities. They knew too much, or appeared to. The leadership did not ask, "Is astrology real?" They asked, "What if it is?" That question haunted them. In 1941, following Rudolf Hess's flight to Britain, a humiliating act the regime blamed on delusion and mystical obsession, the Nazi state moved decisively. Astrology, occult societies, esoteric groups were banned. Practitioners were arrested. Publications were destroyed. The message was broadcast loudly. Germany rejected superstition. But the internal contradiction remained unresolved. The ban did not erase fear. It merely silenced those who spoke of it openly. Astrology became something worse than forbidden knowledge. It became unmentionable. And unmentionable things gain power precisely because they cannot be discussed. Charts continued to be drawn, but now they circulated without attribution, stripped of names. Interpretations were softened, sanitized, rewritten. Truth was no longer the goal. Control was. This shift marked the beginning of astrology's transformation from tool to threat. It was no longer about understanding the future, but about managing belief. Predictions had to be shaped to maintain morale. Warnings had to be buried. Certain alignments simply could not be acknowledged. Astrologers who refused to adapt vanished. Some were imprisoned. Some sent to camps. Some simply erased. The irony was complete. A regime obsessed with destiny could not tolerate anyone who described it honestly. As the war expanded eastward and losses mounted, the gap between ideology and reality widened further. The stars did not offer salvation. They reflected instability, long campaigns, attrition, collapse delayed, but inevitable. For those in power, this was unbearable. The future had to remain conquerable, even if it had to be falsified. Astrology had promised clarity. Instead, it revealed fragility. And fragility, in the Third Reich, was a crime. By the end of Chapter 1, the pattern is clear. Astrology was never about belief. It was about fear. A fear so profound that even a regime built on terror needed reassurance from the sky. The stars did not command the Reich, but the Reich was terrified of what they might say. Karl Ernst Krafft did not believe he was summoning forces. He believed he was measuring them. Born in Basel in 1900, Krafft grew up in a Europe obsessed with order after catastrophe. The First World War had shattered old certainties, and Krafft, too young to fight, old enough to observe, became fixated on one question. Why did events break where they did? Why did some moments explode into violence while others passed quietly? Why did history seem to accelerate at certain points, then stall? He studied mathematics and statistics, disciplines that promised discipline in a disordered world. Numbers did not lie. Patterns repeated. Outliers could be analyzed. Chance, Krafft believed, was merely ignorance wearing a mask. Astrology entered his life not as belief, but as a hypothesis. He treated planetary cycles as time-based variables, not divine agents. To Krafft, the sky was a clock, vast, impersonal, precise. He compared historical crises with celestial configurations and convinced himself that peaks of instability clustered around specific alignments. Wars, assassinations, revolutions. They did not happen at random. They happened when pressure converged. This conviction hardened into obsession. Krafft filled notebooks with tables. He worked late into the night, recalculating dates, correcting margins of error. He distrusted intuition. Everything had to be justified numerically. He rejected mystical language and mocked astrologers who spoke in metaphors. If astrology was to be taken seriously, he argued, it had to be stripped of superstition. In the 1930s, this made him an outsider everywhere. Academic statisticians dismissed him as unscientific. Traditional astrologers found him cold, arrogant, joyless. Political movements had no use for a man who refused slogans. Krafft belonged nowhere, and that isolation would later make him vulnerable. By the time the Nazis rose to power, Krafft was already publishing modest works that went largely unnoticed. He did not praise the regime. He did not openly oppose it. Switzerland offered him neutrality, but also irrelevance. His ideas, circulated quietly, passed between a small circle of readers, interested in cycles, prediction, and catastrophe. Then, Europe moved toward war. Krafft watched events accelerate with a grim sense of confirmation. The patterns he believed in appeared to tighten. Dates clustered ominously. Tension accumulated. He became convinced that the coming conflict would not unfold smoothly, that it would be marked by sudden ruptures, moments when fate snapped. It was this belief that drove him, in early November 1939, to act. He calculated a narrow window, November 7th to 10th, during which, according to his models, violent disruption focused on Adolf Hitler was statistically elevated. Krafft did not frame this as prophecy. He framed it as risk assessment, a warning. The decision to send that warning to German authorities was the most dangerous choice of his life. When the bomb detonated in Munich on November 8th, Kraft's calculations ceased to be theoretical. The Gestapo did not see a statistician. They saw a man who had known. And knowledge, in a dictatorship, is always suspect. Krafft was arrested within days. Interrogations followed, not brutal at first, but relentless. Officials wanted explanations. How had he arrived at the date? Who else knew? Was he connected to the bombers? Krafft insisted on his method, on tables and cycles, on probability. The more he explained, the more alien he sounded. He spoke a language the regime half understood and deeply feared. Yet fear cut both ways. The accuracy of his warning unsettled them. It suggested that the future might be legible, that power could be predicted, and perhaps avoided. For a system obsessed with control, this was intoxicating. Krafft was not released, but he was not immediately destroyed either. Instead, he was repurposed. Officials demanded further calculations, not requests, orders. They wanted dates of danger, windows of opportunity, moments when the Führer should avoid travel, speeches, exposure. Krafft complied, carefully, cautiously. He emphasized probability, not certainty. He warned of volatility rather than doom. But the questions soon changed. How long will the war last? When will England break? Is the Eastern Campaign favored by fate? These were not statistical questions. They were demands for reassurance. Krafft could not provide it. The charts did not point toward swift resolution. They suggested prolonged strain, cycles of escalation, reversal. Krafft softened his language, but he refused to falsify his results. To do so would, in his mind, collapse the entire system. Astrology, if it was to mean anything, had to remain honest. That honesty made him dangerous. By 1941, the political climate shifted sharply. Rudolf Hesse's flight to Britain, an act the regime portrayed as madness, fueled by mystical delusion, gave the Nazis an excuse to purge esoteric practices publicly. Astrology was banned. Practitioners were arrested. The state declared itself immune to superstition. Krafft was caught in the contradiction. Privately, his work was still requested. Publicly, it was condemned. He was kept under surveillance, his movements restricted. The message was clear. He existed on borrowed time. Psychologically, this period broke him. Krafft was not a martyr. He did not see himself as a hero resisting tyranny. He believed in systems, not politics. Yet he could not escape the realization that his work, intended to clarify the future, had drawn him into a machinery that destroyed people. Isolation intensified. Friends distanced themselves. Correspondence was monitored. His calculations, once private, were now extracted without credit, sometimes altered, sometimes misused. Charts circulated without his name. Interpretations were rewritten to suit optimism. Truth was becoming optional. As the war turned against Germany, Stalingrad, mounting losses, relentless Allied bombing, the demand for certainty grew desperate. Leaders wanted guarantees. Astrology could offer none. Kraft's models indicated instability, collapse delayed but unavoidable. He stopped being consulted. He became a reminder of limits, and limits were intolerable. In 1943, Krafft was arrested again, this time not as a consultant, but as a liability. There was no public charge. There did not need to be. He was placed within the concentration camp system, shuffled through bureaucratic darkness. His health deteriorated rapidly. Malnutrition, disease, exhaustion. The irony was merciless. A man who believed history followed measurable cycles was now trapped in a system designed to erase individuals completely. There were no charts for survival inside a camp. No calculations could account for arbitrary cruelty. By early 1945, as the Reich collapsed around him, Krafft was deported east. Somewhere between transport and imprisonment, likely at Buchenwald, he died. The exact date is unclear. Records are fragmentary, unimportant, the system decided. No prophecy marked his death. Krafft left behind no school, no disciples, only fragments of calculations, notes interrupted mid-sentence. His attempt to map destiny ended not with revelation, but with silence. He had tried to make the future legible. Instead, he learned what the Third Reich truly feared. Not ignorance, but knowledge that could not be controlled. The explosion did not just tear through the burgerbraukeller. It tore through the illusion that the future belonged to the Reich. On the night of November 8, 1939, Munich shook under a blast timed with meticulous patience. The bomb had been hidden inside a pillar behind the speaker's podium, constructed over weeks by Georg Elser, a lone carpenter acting without organizational backing. When it detonated at 9:20 p.m., the hall collapsed inward. The ceiling came down in slabs. 8 people were killed. More than 60 were injured. Adolf Hitler was already gone. He had ended his speech earlier than planned and left the hall at 9:07 p.m., boarding his train to Berlin. 13 minutes separated survival from death. Publicly, the regime framed the event as proof of providence. Hitler's escape was celebrated as destiny intervening on behalf of the Führer. Posters and speeches reinforced the message. Fate itself protected him. Privately, the reaction was different. The Gestapo reconstructed every minute, every decision, every deviation from schedule. They interrogated staff, drivers, aides. Why had Hitler left early? Why that night? Why that train? And then the letter surfaced. A warning, written days earlier, naming a narrow window of mortal danger. A warning authored by a man no one in the inner circle had been paying attention to. The existence of Krafft's prediction did not remain a footnote. It became a problem. The Reich could not acknowledge that an astrologer had foreseen what its security apparatus had failed to prevent. To do so would undermine the narrative of total control, but to ignore the coincidence entirely was impossible. The timing was too precise, the implication too unsettling. So the regime chose a familiar solution: containment. Krafft was not paraded. He was not praised. He was brought in quietly. His correspondence seized. His notes examined. His calculations copied. Officials demanded explanations that would allow them to neutralize the event intellectually, turn it into coincidence, chance, statistical anomaly. Krafft refused that framing. He did not claim divine insight. He did not speak of visions. He insisted, again and again, that the danger window was the result of converging cycles, pressure points, a spike in probability. To him, the bomb was confirmation that instability had reached a critical threshold. This answer satisfied no one. If he was right, then the future might be predictable. If he was wrong, then the coincidence was intolerable. Either way, Krafft became dangerous. The Gestapo's questions shifted. They were no longer interested in the past, but the future. When is the next risk? Where should the Führer not go? Which months are unstable? Astrology had crossed a line. It was no longer about curiosity or ideology. It had become security intelligence. Krafft was placed under a form of controlled supervision. He was not free, but he was not yet discarded. He was given access to ephemerides and asked to produce assessments, never officially requested, never officially recorded. Oral briefings, unattributed notes, interpretations stripped of his name. He warned repeatedly against overconfidence. The charts did not promise protection. They suggested volatility. They indicated that narrow escapes would not repeat forever. Krafft emphasized uncertainty, margins of error, the danger of reading inevitability into survival. These cautions were unwelcome. Hitler's inner circle did not want probability. They wanted confirmation of destiny. The Munich escape had already been woven into myth. Astrology was expected to support that myth, not complicate it. As weeks passed, the mood hardened. Krafft's usefulness declined. His warnings, once intriguing, now felt accusatory. He reminded them that survival had been accidental, not ordained. That was unacceptable. Meanwhile, the regime intensified its campaign against superstition. Public denunciations of astrology grew louder. Occult practitioners were arrested. Books were burned. The state insisted it had no use for mystics. Behind closed doors, however, the fear persisted. The Munich bombing had proven something no ideology could erase. Chance could reach the Führer. That realization lingered like a stain. By early 1940, Krafft was effectively sidelined. His calculations were still copied, but increasingly altered. Optimistic interpretations replaced cautious ones. Dates of danger were softened or ignored. Astrology was no longer used to warn, but to reassure. Truth had become negotiable. Krafft sensed the shift. He became more guarded, less cooperative. He understood that he had crossed from consultant to liability. The same prediction that had brought him to the attention of power now marked him as a threat to its narrative. The Munich bomb did not elevate astrology within the Reich. It poisoned it. From that point forward, astrology was no longer a tool for understanding uncertainty. It was a reminder that uncertainty existed at all. And in a system built on absolute confidence, reminders like that were intolerable. The regime did not need astrologers who predicted danger. It needed silence. The consequences of that decision would unfold slowly, bureaucratically, without spectacle. No dramatic execution, no public trial. Just files stamped, permissions withdrawn, transports arranged. The stars had spoken once. The Reich ensured they would not speak again. By 1941, the Third Reich no longer feared defeat. It feared loss of narrative. The war had expanded beyond the clean lines of early victories. Britain had not collapsed. The air war over German cities intensified. Preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union carried enormous risk. The future was no longer something that could be announced with confidence. It had to be managed. Astrology, once tolerated as a quiet curiosity, became inconvenient. The turning point came in May 1941, when Rudolf Hess flew alone to Britain in a failed attempt at peace negotiations. The regime was humiliated. The explanation offered to the public was madness, specifically, mystical delusion. Hess was portrayed as a man unhinged by astrology, prophecy, and irrational belief. The response was immediate and brutal. Astrology, occult societies, esoteric groups, spiritualist circles, everything connected to prediction or fate, was declared dangerous. Practitioners were arrested, books confiscated, publishing houses shut down. The state announced that superstition weakened the German people. Officially, astrology was dead. Unofficially, nothing had changed. The ban was not about disbelief. It was about control. The leadership did not suddenly decide astrology was false. It decided astrology was unmanageable. Predictions created expectations. Warnings created doubt. Doubt spread. And doubt in wartime was poison. So astrology was pushed underground. Charts continued to circulate without signatures. Calculations appeared stripped of interpretation. Reduced to symbols only a few could read. The language softened. Words like danger and loss were replaced with tension and delay. Anything that hinted at collapse was quietly omitted. Astrology had become a censored language. For Karl Ernst Krafft, this shift was catastrophic. He was no longer consulted directly. His role narrowed to producing raw calculations, numbers without conclusions. Even those were sometimes ignored. Other times they were selectively quoted, reframed to support optimism. Krafft began to recognize fragments of his work returning to him, altered, stripped of context, bent to fit political needs. He objected. Not loudly, not publicly, but enough. That was a mistake. The regime did not punish disagreement. It erased it. Krafft was watched more closely. His correspondence restricted. His movements limited. He existed in a gray zone, not arrested, not free. Useful only as long as he did not speak. But silence was not enough. The deeper problem was that Krafft's calculations no longer aligned with what the regime needed. The cycles he observed suggested prolonged conflict, internal strain, periods of instability that would worsen rather than resolve. There were no decisive victories written in the charts, no clean endings. The future, according to the numbers, was uncertain. Uncertainty was intolerable. By 1942, astrology had fully inverted its function. It was no longer consulted to understand the future, but to manufacture confidence. Charts that hinted at danger were buried. Those that could be read optimistically, no matter how forced, were elevated. Astrologers who adapted survived. Astrologers who insisted on accuracy vanished. Krafft belonged to the second group. He refused to falsify outcomes. He refused to promise what he could not calculate. His insistence that probability could not be coerced was interpreted as resistance. And resistance in the Third Reich did not need to be political to be punished. The machinery that removed him did not move quickly. There was no dramatic arrest at first, just bureaucratic narrowing, loss of access, loss of protection, files accumulating, evaluation stamped. He was labeled unreliable, then undesirable, then expendable. By 1943, Krafft was no longer seen as a specialist. He was a problem that had failed to solve itself. The war situation deteriorated. Stalingrad had shattered the myth of inevitability. Bombing raids intensified. The leadership wanted explanations that absolved them, not analyses that reflected reality. Krafft's work did neither. When the order came, it was procedural. He was detained without public charge, absorbed into the concentration camp system, as quietly as he had once been absorbed into consultation. There were no accusations of treason. None were necessary. His value had expired. Astrology, meanwhile, continued its silent existence, not as belief, not as prophecy, but as a shadow practice, used, denied, distorted. The state did not abandon fate. It monopolized it. Destiny could exist only if it confirmed power. Anyone who suggested otherwise was erased. Krafft had not tried to undermine the Reich. He had tried to understand it. He had assumed truth would protect him. Instead, it marked him. The paradox was complete. A regime that claimed to rule by destiny destroyed those who attempted to read it honestly. Astrology had promised clarity. What it revealed was fear, and fear, once exposed, had to be silenced. There was no announcement, no knock meant for neighbors to hear, no accusation read aloud. Karl Ernst Krafft disappeared the way the Third Reich preferred people to disappear, administratively. A form was stamped. A decision justified as routine. A man who had once been consulted, quietly, nervously, was now classified as unreliable. That word carried a specific meaning inside the system. It meant there would be no defense, no appeal, no explanation owed. Krafft was arrested again in 1943, this time without ambiguity. Not as an advisor, not as a curiosity, as a problem to be removed. He was placed inside the concentration camp network, an ecosystem designed not simply to imprison, but to erase. Names were replaced by numbers. Time dissolved. Survival became arbitrary. There were no charts here, no cycles to calculate, only hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Witness accounts from camps like Buchenwald describe a world governed by randomness, masquerading as order. Roll calls that lasted for hours in freezing weather. Beatings for mistakes that could not be anticipated. Disease spreading unchecked. Death occurring quietly, often without record. For a man who believed the future could be measured, this was annihilating. Krafft's mind, once structured by tables and probabilities, was forced to confront a system where outcomes had no logic, where compliance did not ensure survival, where intelligence offered no protection. The camp was the negation of everything he believed about order. And yet, even here, fear of knowledge persisted. Political prisoners, intellectuals, specialists, men who knew things, were treated with particular suspicion. They were watched, isolated, prevented from forming networks. The regime understood instinctively that ideas could survive where bodies did not. Krafft was not beaten into confession. There was nothing to confess. His punishment was silence. No one asked him about the stars anymore. As the war turned decisively against Germany in 1944, conditions worsened. Food rations shrank. Transports increased. The camps filled with men evacuated from the east as Allied forces advanced. Order broke down further. Death accelerated. By early 1945, with the Reich collapsing, Krafft was placed on a transport eastward. Records from this period are fragmented, deliberately so. Prisoners were moved without documentation. Deaths went unregistered. People vanished between stations, between camps, between days. Somewhere during this final movement, likely weakened by malnutrition, illness, and exhaustion, Karl Ernst Krafft died. There was no prophecy for it, no alignment noted, no chart drawn, no date preserved. The man who once warned of danger windows vanished into one of them. After the war, his name surfaced only briefly, in footnotes, in archives, in uncomfortable questions about why a regime that claimed to reject superstition had quietly relied on it, why a state obsessed with destiny had destroyed those who tried to describe it honestly. The answer was not mystical. It was human. Krafft had done something unforgivable in a totalitarian system. He introduced uncertainty. He suggested that power was vulnerable, that survival was conditional, that the future could not be commanded, only approximated. The Reich could tolerate cruelty. It could tolerate failure. It could even tolerate hypocrisy. What it could not tolerate was a man who reminded it that fate does not belong to those who claim it. Krafft's charts are gone, his calculations incomplete. What remains is the outline of a life crushed not by belief, but by the fear that belief might be wrong. The stars did not kill him. A system terrified of the future did. By January 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing in fragments. Rail lines were bombed. Communications failed. Orders contradicted one another. Camps overflowed with prisoners evacuated from the east, driven westward in freezing weather as Allied forces advanced. Trains moved without schedules. Lists were incomplete. Names were crossed out, rewritten, or never recorded at all. This was the final stage of the system, administrative chaos pretending to be control. Karl Ernst Krafft was already weak by then. Years of confinement, malnutrition, and illness had reduced him to a body barely capable of standing through roll call. Whatever protection his former usefulness might once have offered was gone. The regime no longer needed explanations. It needed space, speed, erasure. He was placed on a transport. No destination was clearly marked. Prisoners were packed into wagons meant for freight, not people. Food was scarce, water scarcer. The cold penetrated everything. Men died quietly. Their bodies left until the train stopped, if it stopped. Somewhere during this movement, likely in January 1945, Krafft died. The precise place does not matter. The precise cause does not matter. The system ensured that such details would dissolve. There was no document announcing his death. No entry noting the end of a man who had once calculated risk windows for the most powerful figures in Europe. His life concluded the way millions of others did in the final months of the war. Anonymously, inefficiently, without witnesses who could afford to remember. No prophecy accompanied it. For a man who had spent his life attempting to measure the future, the absence was absolute. No chart marked the moment. No cycle closed. His calculations ended mid-thought, interrupted not by revelation, but by exhaustion. In the ruins of the Reich, his death registered as nothing. And that was the point. After the war, the files were opened. What remained of them? Investigators found evidence of brutality, logistics, industrial murder. They also found something less tangible and more unsettling: traces of fear, notes without signatures, calculations without attribution, quiet consultations denied in public but pursued in private. The Third Reich had mocked superstition while secretly fearing it. It had banned astrology while exploiting it. It had destroyed mystics publicly and listened to them privately, until their answers became inconvenient. This was not hypocrisy. It was strategy. Astrology was never about belief. It was about permission. When the stars appeared to confirm victory, they were useful. When they suggested danger, they were silenced. When they implied limits to power, they became enemies. Karl Ernst Krafft did not die because he believed in astrology. He died because he treated the future as something that could be analyzed honestly. And honesty is intolerable to regimes that survive on inevitability. The most horrifying truth is not that the Nazis consulted astrologers. It is why they did. They were not searching for guidance. They were searching for reassurance. They wanted the universe itself to approve their choices. And when it didn't, when the calculations hinted at uncertainty, delay, collapse, they destroyed the messenger. The stars never ruled the Third Reich. But fear did. And fear, once given a language, always demands silence in return.